I never imagined that a simple request for maternity leave would become the catalyst that exposed the corruption festering within Morrison & Associates. My name is Sarah, and 6 months ago, I thought I understood exactly where I stood in the corporate hierarchy of one of Chicago's most prestigious consulting firms. I was wrong about everything, including who really held the power to change my life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in HR buzzed with that particular frequency that always made my temples throb as I sat across from Janet Hoffman, the Director of Human Resources. Her perfectly manicured nails clicked against her mahogany desk in a rhythm that seemed designed to communicate impatience. Behind her, certificates and corporate achievement awards created a shrine to professional bureaucracy, each frame positioned with military precision. "Sarah," Janet began, her voice carrying that practiced tone of administrative authority, "I've reviewed your request for extended maternity leave, and I'm afraid it's simply not feasible given your current position and tenure with the firm." I felt my stomach clench, not from the morning sickness that had been my constant companion for the past month, but from the cold dismissal in her words. 3 years of exemplary performance reviews, countless overtime hours, and successful project. Completions apparently meant nothing when measured against the firm's convenience. "I'm not asking for anything beyond what's outlined in the employee handbook," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the frustration building in my chest. "The policy clearly states that employees are entitled to 12 weeks of family leave, with the option to extend to 16 weeks with supervisor approval." Janet's smile was as sharp as her perfectly straight teeth. "That's correct for employees who have been with the firm for more than 5 years or hold senior associate positions. You're currently a junior associate with 3 years of service. Your entitlement is limited to the federal minimum of 12 weeks, unpaid, of course." The word unpaid hit me like a physical blow. My husband David and I had carefully planned our finances around the assumption that I would have some income during my leave. The employee handbook I had studied so thoroughly seemed to have different interpretations depending on who was reading it. "Janet," I said, leaning forward slightly, "I've generated more billable hours than any other junior associate for 2 consecutive years. I've brought in 3 major clients through my network. Surely there's some flexibility in the policy for exceptional circumstances." Her expression didn't change. If anything, it became more rigid. "Sarah, company policies exist for a reason. They ensure fairness and consistency across all employees. Making exceptions, regardless of individual performance, would set a dangerous precedent that could expose the firm to legal complications." The irony of her concern about legal complications wasn't lost on me, given what I would later discover about Morrison & Associates' actual practices. But in that moment, sitting in her sterile office with its motivational posters about teamwork and excellence, I felt powerless against the machinery of corporate indifference. The meeting had started 20 minutes earlier when I knocked. On Janet's door, my carefully prepared talking points organized in a folder that now felt heavy in my hands. I had anticipated potential resistance, but I had also believed that logic and documentation would prevail. 3 years of working at Morrison & Associates had taught me that the firm valued results above all else, or so I thought. Morrison & Associates occupied floors 30 through 35 of the Hancock Tower, its glass walls offering commanding views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline. The firm specialized in corporate restructuring and strategic consulting, serving clients ranging from mid-sized regional companies to Fortune 500 corporations. It was the kind of place where young professionals came to build careers that would define their futures, where the promise of partnership dangled like a carrot for those willing to sacrifice everything else. I had joined the firm straight out of Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, drawn by its reputation for mentoring emerging talent and its impressive client roster. The starting salary was competitive, the benefits package comprehensive, And the opportunities for advancement seemed abundant for those willing to work hard and demonstrate value. During my first year, I had thrown myself into every assignment with the dedication of someone who believed that excellence would be recognized and rewarded. I worked weekends without complaint, stayed late to perfect presentations, and volunteered for the challenging projects that others avoided. My performance reviews consistently rated me as exceeds expectations, and my supervising partners often praised my analytical skills and client rapport. By my second year, I had been assigned to lead portions of major engagements, a responsibility typically reserved for more senior associates. When I successfully negotiated a contract extension with Meridian Industries that generated an additional $2 million in revenue, the managing partners publicly acknowledged my contribution during the quarterly all-hands meeting. I felt like I was building something meaningful, creating a foundation for long-term success. The third year brought even greater responsibilities and recognition. I was invited to pitch meetings with prospective clients, included in strategic planning sessions, and given oversight of junior analysts. When Hartwell Corporation specifically requested that I lead their operational assessment, it felt like validation of everything I had worked toward. My billable hours consistently exceeded targets. My client satisfaction scores ranked in the top 5% of all associates, and I had every reason to believe that I was on track for promotion to senior associate. That confidence made Janet's dismissal of my maternity leave request all the more jarring. I had assumed that my track record would carry weight in discussions about policy flexibility. Instead, I found myself being lectured about precedent and consistency by someone whose own tenure at the firm had been marked by what could charitably be described as unremarkable performance. Janet, I tried again, what if we structured this differently? I could work remotely during part of the extended leave period, maintaining client contact and handling urgent matters. Several other firms have implemented flexible arrangements that benefit both the employee and the company. She shook her head before I finished speaking. Remote work during family leave defeats the purpose of the leave itself, Sarah. It creates liability issues for the firm and undermines the integrity of our leave policies. The legal department has been very clear about maintaining strict boundaries between work and personal time during any form of leave. The mention of the legal department struck me as particularly ironic, given that my undergraduate degree was in business law and I had consistently provided accurate legal interpretations for client matters. But Janet's reference to higher authority was clearly intended to end the discussion rather than continue it. Is there anyone else I could speak with about this? I asked, though I already knew the answer from the way her posture had shifted into full defensive mode. Perhaps someone in senior management who might have additional perspective on exceptional cases? The decision has been made, Sarah, she said, her tone carrying a finality that felt rehearsed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I have consulted with the appropriate stakeholders, and the policy will be applied as written. You're entitled to 12 weeks of unpaid leave following the birth of your child. I suggest you use that time to consider your long-term priorities. The phrase long-term priorities hung in the air like a threat disguised as advice. The implication was clear. Women who chose to have children were choosing to deprioritize their careers, and the firm would treat them accordingly. It was a message I had heard whispered in conference rooms and implied in partner meetings, but never stated so directly. I looked around Janet's office again, taking in the details I had missed during my initial nervousness. The family photo on her desk showed her with 2 teenage children, suggesting that she had navigated her own work-life balance challenges. Yet her approach to my situation seemed devoid of any empathy or recognition of shared experience. Perhaps her rise to director had required the same kind of compartmentalization she was now demanding from me. I'd like to submit a formal appeal of this decision, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. There must be a process for reviewing policy interpretations when they seem inconsistent with the firm's stated values. Janet's smile turned patronizing. Of course, you're entitled to file an appeal, though I should warn you that it will require documentation of why you believe the policy has been misapplied. The appeals committee will review the decision, but they rarely overturn HR determinations, particularly when the policy language is as clear as it is in this case. She reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the polished surface toward me. This is the formal appeals process. You have 14 days from today to submit your documentation. The committee typically reviews appeals within 30 days, though complex cases can take longer. I accepted the paper, scanning its contents quickly. The appeals process was bureaucratic in the extreme, requiring multiple levels of documentation, supervisor endorsements, and review by a committee comprised entirely of senior partners. The timeline alone would push any resolution well past my due date, making the entire process academic rather than practical. Janet, I said, folding the appeals document carefully, can I ask you something directly? Do you genuinely believe that denying extended maternity leave to high-performing employees serves the firm's best interests? Or is this about maintaining control and discouraging women from advancing to senior positions? The question clearly caught her off guard. For the first time since I had entered her office, her practiced composure faltered slightly. She recovered quickly, but not before I glimpsed something that might have been discomfort or even guilt. Sarah, that's an inappropriate characterization of the firm's policies, she said, her voice rising slightly. Morrison & Associates is committed to equal opportunity employment and supports work-life balance for all employees. The leave policies are gender neutral and apply equally to all forms of family leave. The response was textbook corporate speak, the kind of language designed to deflect rather than address the underlying question. But her defensive reaction suggested that my observation had struck closer to truth than she was comfortable acknowledging. I had worked at Morrison & Associates long enough to observe patterns in how different types of employees were treated. Male associates who took paternity leave seemed to face no career consequences, while women who used family leave often found themselves assigned to less prestigious projects upon their return. The firm's partnership track record spoke volumes. Of the 43 partners, only 8 were women, and most of those had joined the firm before having children. I appreciate your time, Janet, I said, standing to leave. I'll be filing that appeal, and I'll be very interested to see how the committee interprets the firm's commitment to supporting its employees. As I walked toward her office door, Janet called after me. Sarah, I hope you'll consider what's really best for your family. Sometimes the most responsible choice is to acknowledge that circumstances change, and our priorities need to change with them. The comment stopped me in my tracks. I turned back to face her, studying her expression carefully. There was something in her tone that went beyond policy enforcement, something that sounded almost like a warning. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked. I'm suggesting that you think carefully about whether pursuing this appeal is worth the potential consequences, she said. Her voice lowered as if she were sharing confidential information. The partners don't appreciate employees who challenge established procedures, particularly when those challenges could be interpreted as questioning the firm's integrity. The threat was unmistakable now, wrapped in the language of friendly advice but clearly intended to discourage me from pursuing my rights. I felt a flash of anger that surprised me with its intensity. Throughout my career, I had been careful to work within the system, to advance through merit and collaboration rather than confrontation. But Janet's attempt at intimidation struck me as fundamentally wrong, a betrayal of everything the firm claimed to represent. Thank you for clarifying the firm's position, I said, meeting her gaze directly. I'll be sure to document this conversation thoroughly when I file my appeal. I left her office with my head held high, though my hands were trembling slightly as I walked down the corridor toward the elevator bank. The threat had been subtle but unmistakable, and it raised questions about what Morrison & Associates was really willing to do to maintain its preferred narrative about employee relations. The elevator ride to my office on the 32nd floor gave me a few minutes to process what had just occurred. I had entered Janet's office believing that I was engaging in a routine administrative discussion about leave benefits. Instead, I had encountered institutional resistance that seemed designed to push me out of the firm entirely. The realization was both infuriating and clarifying. My office was small but well-appointed, with a view of the city that reminded me daily of how far I had come since graduating from Northwestern. The walls were decorated with certificates from professional development programs, photos from successful project completions, and a small collection of client appreciation gifts that represented relationships I had built through careful attention and genuine expertise. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I considered my next steps. The appeals process Janet had outlined seemed designed to be discouraging rather than genuinely accessible. But something in her demeanor during our conversation suggested that there were layers to this situation I didn't yet understand. Before drafting my appeal, I decided to review my employee handbook more carefully, paying particular attention to the language around leave policies and appeals procedures. As I read through the dense legal text, I began to notice inconsistencies that I had missed during my initial review. The policy manual contained contradictory statements about tenure requirements, conflicting information about paid versus unpaid leave, and references to procedures that weren't fully explained elsewhere. In the document, the more I studied the handbook, the more convinced I became that the policies were intentionally confusing, designed to discourage employees from fully understanding their rights. Janet's confident assertion that my situation was clearly covered by existing policy seemed less authoritative when viewed against the actual complexity of the documentation. I pulled up my employment contract, something I hadn't reviewed since my initial hire 3 years earlier. The language around benefits and leave was surprisingly vague, with several references to policies as amended from time to time and subject to management discretion. It was the kind of contract language that provided maximum flexibility to the employer while offering minimal protection to the employee. As I worked through the documentation, my phone buzzed with a text message from my husband, David. "How did the meeting go? Call me when you have a chance." David worked as a software engineer for a tech startup downtown, a position that offered excellent benefits and a genuinely supportive culture around work-life balance. His company had recently expanded their parental leave policies to include 6 months of paid time off for any employee, regardless of gender or tenure. The contrast with Morrison & Associates couldn't have been more stark. I called him back, needing to hear a supportive voice after the morning's frustrating encounter. "Sarah, how did it go with HR?" David's voice carried the optimism of someone who expected reasonable people to reach reasonable solutions. "Not well," I admitted, sinking back in my desk chair. Janet denied the request outright. No flexibility, no consideration of my performance record, just a flat, no based on tenure. "Requirements. That's ridiculous," David said, his voice carrying the indignation I felt but hadn't fully expressed. "You've been their top performer for 2 years running. How can they not value that kind of contribution?" Apparently, individual performance doesn't matter when it comes to policy interpretation, I said, hearing the bitterness in my own voice. She made it very clear that challenging the decision would be viewed unfavorably by the partners. David was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "Sarah, that sounds like retaliation. They can't threaten your job because you're asking for benefits you're entitled to." "That's what I thought too," I said. But the whole conversation felt like I was being pushed toward a predetermined outcome. Like they want me to conclude that staying with the firm isn't compatible with having a family. "Maybe that's exactly what they want," David said quietly. "Maybe the policy isn't really about leave at all. Maybe it's about maintaining a certain type of workforce." His observation echoed thoughts I had been reluctant to fully acknowledge. The demographic composition of Morrison & Associates' senior ranks suggested a pattern that went beyond coincidence. The few women who had advanced to partnership had either remained childless or had children much later in their careers, after establishing themselves as indispensable to the firm's operations. "I'm going to file the appeal anyway," I said, feeling a resolve crystallize as I spoke. "Even if it doesn't change the outcome, at least there will be a record of what happened." "Good," David said firmly. "And if they retaliate, we'll document that too. You have rights, Sarah, and you shouldn't have to choose between your career and our family." After ending the call, I spent the rest of the afternoon drafting my appeal, carefully documenting every aspect of my conversation with Janet, and building a case based on my performance record and the firm's stated commitment to supporting employee development. The process was time-consuming but also therapeutic, allowing me to channel my frustration into a structured argument that addressed both the policy interpretation and the broader implications of the decision. As I worked, colleagues stopped by my office with their usual mix of project updates and casual conversation. None of them knew about my pregnancy yet, as David and I had decided to wait until the end of the first trimester before making any announcements. But their easy assumption that everything was proceeding normally in my career made me acutely aware of how much my situation was about to change. Mark Stevens, a senior associate who had started at the firm 6 months before me, knocked on my doorframe around 4 o'clock. "Sarah, do you have a minute? I wanted to get your thoughts on the Hartwell engagement before tomorrow's client meeting." Mark had always been collegial and professional, one of the few senior associates who genuinely mentored junior staff, rather than viewing them as competition. His success at the firm had been steady and well-deserved, based on solid analytical skills and strong client relationships. "Of course," I said, gesturing for him to take the chair across from my desk. "What's on your mind?" "The client is pushing back on our recommendations for their operational restructuring," he said, spreading out several charts and graphs on my desk. "They're concerned about the timeline and the potential impact on employee morale. I know you've dealt with similar resistance in other engagements. How do you typically address those concerns?" The question was exactly the kind of professional collaboration that made me value working at Morrison & Associates. Despite the morning's frustrating encounter with HR, the actual work remained intellectually stimulating and genuinely meaningful. I found myself energized by the problem-solving discussion, my earlier anger temporarily set aside in favor of strategic analysis. The key is usually to reframe the timeline in terms of competitive advantage rather than just operational efficiency, I said, pulling up relevant data on my computer. If you can show them how the delayed implementation actually costs them market position, they're more likely to accept short-term disruption for long-term benefit. We spent the next 30 minutes developing a presentation strategy that addressed the client's concerns while maintaining the integrity of our recommendations. It was the kind of productive collaboration that reminded me why I had chosen consulting in the first place, the satisfaction of solving complex problems through careful analysis and creative thinking. As Mark gathered his materials to leave, he paused at my office door. "Sarah, can I ask you something? You seemed a little off today. Everything okay?" The question caught me off guard. I had thought I was hiding my stress effectively, but Mark's observational skills had always been sharp. I considered how much to share, weighing my desire for confidentiality against my need for perspective from someone who understood the firm's culture. "I had a frustrating meeting with HR this morning," I said carefully. "Nothing that affects my work quality. Just some policy interpretation issues that didn't go the way I expected." Mark's expression shifted to something more serious. "Policy interpretation issues? That sounds ominous. Anything I can help with, or is it personal stuff?" "Personal stuff," I confirmed. "But thanks for asking. I'll work it out." He nodded, accepting my boundaries while making it clear that the offer of support remained open. "You know, Sarah, you've been one of the strongest performers in our class since day one. Whatever's going on, don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here." The comment was both supportive and revealing, Mark's assumption that someone was challenging my place at the firm suggested that such challenges weren't uncommon, that he had witnessed or experienced similar situations during his tenure. After he left, I returned to my appeal documentation with renewed focus. The afternoon light slanting through my office windows created patterns on the wall that shifted and changed as the hours passed, a reminder that time was moving forward regardless of my personal circumstances. By 6 o'clock, I had completed a comprehensive 15-page appeal that addressed every aspect of Janet's decision and provided extensive documentation of my contributions to the firm. The appeals process required submission to the managing partner's office, which meant my request would be reviewed by Robert Morrison himself, the founding partner whose name appeared on the firm's letterhead. I had met Morrison only briefly, during firm-wide meetings and partnership announcements, but his reputation as a shrewd businessman and demanding leader was well established throughout the organization. As I prepared to leave the office, I made copies of my appeal and supporting documentation, storing originals in my locked desk drawer, and taking copies home for my personal files. The paranoia felt excessive, but Janet's veiled threats had made me more cautious about protecting my interests. The commute home on the L train gave me time to decompress from the day's events and consider my next steps. The appeal would take weeks to process, during which time I would need to continue performing at my usual high level while managing the stress of an uncertain outcome. The challenge would be maintaining my professional focus while dealing with the emotional impact of feeling undervalued and potentially unwelcome at a firm where I had invested 3 years of my career. David was waiting in our Lincoln Park apartment with takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant, a small gesture that felt like an enormous comfort after the day's battles. Our one-bedroom space was modest but comfortable, filled with books, plants, and the accumulated evidence of 2 people building a life together with intention and care. "How did the appeal writing go?" he asked as we settled at our small dining table overlooking the tree-lined street below. "Comprehensive," I said, accepting the plate he handed me. 15 pages of careful documentation and logical argument that probably won't change anything, but at least creates a record of what happened. "You never know," David said optimistically. "Maybe someone in senior management will actually read it and recognize that they're about to lose one of their best people over a policy that doesn't make business sense." I appreciated his confidence, even as I doubted its foundation in reality. My 3 years at Morrison & Associates had taught me that the firm's decision-making process was more complex and less merit-based than it appeared from the outside. Relationships, politics, and unspoken hierarchies often mattered more than documented performance or logical arguments. "David," I said, setting down my fork, "what if this doesn't work out the way we hoped? What if I end up having to leave the firm?" He reached across the table to take my hand. "Then we figure out something else. You're brilliant, Sarah. You're going to be successful wherever you end up. Morrison & Associates doesn't define your worth or your potential." The reassurance was exactly what I needed to hear, even as part of me remained attached to the vision of success I had built around partnership at the firm. 3 years of investment in relationships, projects, and professional development represented significant career capital that would be difficult to replicate elsewhere. "I keep thinking about what Janet said," I admitted, "about priorities and consequences. Like she was warning me that pursuing this could damage my career even if I win the appeal." David's expression darkened. "That's exactly the kind of intimidation tactic that makes the whole system work. They make people afraid to advocate for themselves, so most employees just accept whatever they're offered and don't push back." But what if she's right? What if challenging them marks me as a troublemaker and makes it harder to advance even if I stay with the firm? "Then the firm isn't worth advancing in," David said firmly. "Sarah, you want to work for an organization that punishes employees for knowing their rights? That treats pregnancy like a career liability?" His clarity was both refreshing and challenging. David's tech company operated with a transparency and fairness that made Morrison and Associates' approach seem archaic by comparison. But consulting firms operated in a different cultural context, one where traditional hierarchies and unspoken rules still carried significant weight. We spent the evening discussing scenarios and options, trying to plan for outcomes that ranged from complete vindication to potential retaliation. The conversation was both practical and emotional, touching on our financial planning, career goals, and fundamental values about work and family. By the time we went to bed, I felt more grounded in my decision to pursue the appeal while remaining realistic about the potential challenges ahead. The process would be difficult and uncertain, but the alternative was accepting a system that seemed fundamentally unfair and potentially discriminatory. As I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of our neighborhood settling into night, I reflected on how much my perspective had changed in a single day. That morning, I had approached the HR meeting as a routine administrative matter, confident that my track record would speak for itself. By evening, I was questioning assumptions about fairness, merit, and opportunity that I had taken for granted throughout my career. The pregnancy that should have been a source of pure joy had become complicated by institutional resistance that felt both personal and political. But beneath the stress and uncertainty, I felt a growing determination to stand up for principles that extended beyond my individual situation. If Morrison and Associates was systematically discouraging women from advancing while maintaining a public commitment to equality, that was a problem that affected far more people than just me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as I continued, working on client projects while navigating the appeals process. But tonight, surrounded by the comfort of home and David's unwavering support, I felt ready to fight for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The battle lines had been drawn, and I was prepared to see where they led. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray December sky that made Chicago feel like it existed in perpetual twilight. I stood at my kitchen window, watching commuters hurry past with their collars turned up against the wind, and wondered how many of them were carrying secrets that could change everything about their carefully constructed lives. I certainly was. My phone buzzed with a text from my college roommate, Jessica, who now worked as a corporate attorney in New York. "Coffee catch-up call today? I have news." Her timing was uncanny, as if she somehow sensed that I needed perspective. From someone who understood both corporate culture and the particular challenges facing professional women. I had met Jessica during orientation week at Northwestern, where we bonded over our shared ambition and slightly obsessive study habits. She had gone on to Harvard Law School while I pursued my MBA, but we had maintained a close friendship built on brutal honesty and unwavering support. If anyone could help me navigate the political minefield I was facing, it would be Jess. Walking to work that morning, I found myself studying the Morrison and Associates building with new eyes. The gleaming tower that had once represented opportunity and prestige now seemed imposing in a different way, like a fortress designed to keep certain people out, rather than invite the best talent in. The marble lobby with its expensive artwork and fresh flowers felt less welcoming than it had just 24 hours earlier. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor gave me time to prepare mentally for what I knew would be a challenging day. Word traveled fast in consulting firms, and I suspected that Janet had already begun shaping the narrative around my maternity leave request. The key would be maintaining my professional demeanor, while carefully observing how colleagues and supervisors responded to me in the coming days. My assistant, Michelle, was already at her desk when I arrived, sorting through a stack of overnight deliveries and client communications. Michelle had been with the firm for 5 years, working her way up from the reception desk to supporting senior associates. Her institutional knowledge and sharp observational skills had made her invaluable to my project management efforts. "Good morning, Sarah," she said, looking up from a particularly thick contract document. "The Hartwell team wants to schedule a conference call for this afternoon, and you have 3 new client inquiries that came in overnight. Also, Mr. Peterson asked if you could stop by his office when you have a moment." James Peterson was the senior partner who supervised most of my major engagements, a man in his early 50s who had built his reputation on strategic restructuring projects for manufacturing companies. He was demanding but fair, with a management style that emphasized results over office politics. If Peterson wanted to see me, it was likely related to client work rather than personnel matters. Did he mention what it was regarding? I asked, settling into my desk chair and powering up my computer. He just said it was about project assignments for the new quarter, Michelle replied, but something in her tone suggested there might be more to it. He seemed a little more formal than usual. The observation sent a small chill through me. Michelle's ability to read the subtle shifts in office dynamics had proven accurate countless times over the years. If she sensed something different about Peterson's demeanor, it was worth taking seriously. I spent the first hour of my day reviewing client files and preparing for the afternoon's conference call, but my concentration kept drifting to questions about how my appeal might be affecting perceptions of my commitment to the firm. The corporate consulting world operated on unspoken rules about loyalty and team players, and challenging HR decisions could easily be interpreted as disruptive behavior. Around 10 o'clock, I made my way to Peterson's corner office, passing through the senior partner corridor that represented the pinnacle of achievement at Morrison & Associates. The offices were larger and more luxuriously appointed than those on the associate floors, with expensive furniture and original artwork that spoke to both success and exclusivity. Peterson's assistant waved me toward his partially open door, where I could hear him concluding a phone call with what sounded like a difficult client. His office commanded a spectacular view of Lake Michigan, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made the space feel both expansive and intimate. "Sarah, come in," he said, gesturing toward the leather chairs arranged around a small conference table. "Thank you for making time on short notice." James Peterson had always struck me as someone who had earned his position through competence rather than politics, though I was beginning to understand that the two were often inseparable in corporate environments. His gray hair and weathered face suggested someone who had weathered numerous business cycles, and his direct communication style had always made him one of my preferred supervisors. "Of course," I said, taking the offered seat. Michelle mentioned it was about project assignments for the next quarter. "Partly," he said, settling across from me with a manila folder that he placed on the table without opening. "But I also wanted to discuss some organizational changes that might affect your role going forward." The phrase, organizational changes, carried ominous implications in consulting firms, where restructuring was often a euphemism for downsizing or role reduction. My stomach tightened as I waited for him to continue. "The firm is implementing a new client assignment system that emphasizes continuity and relationship management," Peterson explained, his tone carefully neutral. "We've been getting feedback that some of our clients prefer working with the same team members throughout the duration of their engagements, even when projects extend over multiple quarters." This was news to me, and it contradicted everything I understood about how Morrison & Associates had traditionally operated. The firm's strength had always been its ability to assemble specialized teams for specific client needs, drawing expertise from across different practice areas and seniority levels. The flexibility to move resources between projects was considered a competitive advantage. "That's interesting," I said carefully. "Has this feedback been consistent across client types? Or is it more specific to certain industries or engagement sizes?" Peterson shifted slightly in his chair, a tell I had learned to recognize during client negotiations. He was preparing to deliver information that he knew would be unwelcome. "The feedback has been most pronounced with our larger, longer-term clients," he said. "Companies like Hartwell Corporation, Meridian Industries, and Bannister Holdings have specifically requested that their primary team members remain consistent throughout their engagement cycles." The mention of Hartwell Corporation was particularly significant, since I had been the lead associate on their account for the past 8 months. The client relationship had been one of my most successful, with consistently positive feedback, and 2 contract extensions that had generated substantial revenue for the firm. "I'm surprised to hear that," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral despite growing concern. My interactions with the Hartwell team have been very positive. In fact, they specifically requested that I continue leading their operational assessment into the next phase. Peterson nodded, acknowledging my point while clearly preparing to contradict it. "That's true, and your work on their account has been excellent. However, the new system requires us to think about long-term sustainability and succession planning. We need to ensure that client relationships aren't too dependent on any single individual." The logic was reasonable on its surface, but the timing felt suspicious. Less than 24 hours after filing my maternity leave appeal, I was being told that my client assignments were being restructured in the name of sustainability and succession planning. The coincidence seemed unlikely. "What does this mean for my current workload?" I asked directly. "In the short term, you'll be transitioning your primary responsibilities on the Hartwell account to Mark Stevens," Peterson said, finally opening the manila folder to reveal what appeared to be a detailed transition plan. Mark has been shadowing the account for the past month, so he's already familiar with the client requirements and project timeline. The revelation that Mark had been shadowing my account without my knowledge was both shocking and illuminating. Mark was a competent associate, but he lacked the specialized expertise in operational restructuring that had made me valuable to Hartwell in the first place. More importantly, the secret preparation for my removal suggested that this decision had been made well before my maternity leave request. "James," I said, using his first name to signal that I wanted a direct conversation rather than a formal briefing, "is this related to my family leave request? Because if it is, we need to discuss the legal implications of what appears to be retaliation." His expression didn't change, but I noticed his hand still slightly on the papers in front of him. "Sarah, this is purely a business decision based on client feedback and operational efficiency. Your personal circumstances have no bearing on project assignments." The denial was too quick and too emphatic to be entirely convincing. Moreover, his use of the phrase personal circumstances rather than maternity leave suggested an attempt to minimize the significance of my pregnancy in a way that felt deliberately evasive. "I'd like to speak directly with the Hartwell team about this transition," I said. "Since they've been satisfied with my work, I want to ensure that the change serves their interests rather than creating unnecessary disruption." Peterson shook his head firmly. "That won't be necessary. Mark will handle all client communications going forward. We want to present a unified transition rather than creating confusion or the impression that there are internal disagreements about account management." The prohibition against client contact was the clearest indication yet that this decision was about controlling the narrative rather than serving client needs. If the transition were truly in Hartwell's best interests, there would be no reason to prevent me from participating in the handover process. "What will my new assignments be?" I asked, already suspecting that the answer would be less prestigious. "Projects with lower visibility. We're putting together a portfolio of smaller engagements that will allow you to work across multiple client relationships," Peterson said, pulling out another set of documents. 3 different companies, all requiring strategic analysis and implementation support. It's actually a great opportunity to broaden your experience base. I reviewed the project descriptions he handed me, immediately recognizing them as the type of assignments typically given to first- and second-year associates. The clients were smaller, the budgets were limited, and the scope of work was far less complex than what I had been handling with Hartwell. It was a clear demotion disguised as professional development. "James, these projects represent about half the billing hours of my current workload," I observed. "How does that align with the firm's expectations for senior associate performance?" "We're adjusting performance metrics to account for the changing client landscape," he said, a response that sounded rehearsed. "Quality of work and client satisfaction, will be weighted more heavily than raw billing hours in future evaluations. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Peterson providing detailed explanations for each aspect of my new assignment structure, while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement that the changes represented a significant reduction in my responsibilities and earning potential. His corporate speak was polished and professional, but the underlying message was unmistakable. I was being marginalized in response to my maternity leave appeal. As I walked back to my office, I felt a familiar mixture of anger and determination that reminded me of competitive debate tournaments in college. The challenge wasn't just about winning an argument, it was about exposing contradictions in the opposing position and building a case that could withstand scrutiny. Michelle looked up expectantly as I passed her desk, clearly curious about what had transpired in Peterson's office. I had always maintained appropriate boundaries between personal and professional information with my assistant, but her loyalty and observational skills made her a valuable ally in navigating office politics. "How did it go?" she asked quietly, glancing around to ensure we wouldn't be overheard. "Interesting developments in project assignments," I said carefully. "I'll need to update my calendar for the next few weeks as things get sorted out." She nodded, understanding that I was providing information without asking her to take sides or participate in anything that could compromise her position. Michelle had survived 5 years at Morrison & Associates by being helpful without becoming entangled in conflicts between senior staff. I spent the rest of the morning documenting everything I could remember about my conversation with Peterson, including his exact words about client feedback and succession planning. The notes would be crucial if I needed to build a case for retaliation, particularly since Peterson had been careful to avoid stating directly that my reassignment was related to my pregnancy. Around noon, I received an unexpected visitor. Rebecca Martinez knocked on my office door, her expression suggesting that she had information to share rather than routine business to discuss. Rebecca was a senior associate in the litigation support division, someone I knew primarily through firm social events and occasional project collaborations. "Sarah, do you have a few minutes for a private conversation?" she asked, closing my office door behind her. Rebecca and I had always maintained a cordial but somewhat distant relationship, partly because our practice areas rarely overlapped, and partly because she had a reputation for being extremely careful about office politics. Her request for a private conversation was unexpected and potentially significant. "Of course," I said, gesturing for her to take the chair across from my desk. "What's on your mind?" "I heard through the grapevine that you're having some issues with HR," she said, keeping her voice low despite the closed door. "I wanted to share some information that might be relevant to your situation." The comment caught me off guard. I had been careful not to discuss my maternity leave appeal with colleagues, and I was surprised that word had already spread through the firm's informal communication networks. "What kind of information?" I asked, curious about what Rebecca might know about HR practices at Morrison & Associates. 2 years ago, I went through something similar when I requested extended family leave to care for my mother during her cancer treatment, Rebecca said, her voice carrying the weight of someone sharing a difficult experience. Janet Hoffman denied my request using almost identical language to what I've heard she used with you. This was the first time I had heard about another employee experiencing similar treatment from HR, and it suggested that my situation might be part of a broader pattern rather than an isolated incident. "What happened with your appeal?" I asked. "I filed one, just like you're doing," Rebecca said. "It was denied by the appeals committee after a 6-week review process. The committee concluded that HR had correctly interpreted the policy and that my request didn't meet the criteria for exceptional circumstances. The information was discouraging, but not entirely surprising. The appeals process had seemed designed to be discouraging rather than genuinely accessible from the moment Janet had described it. "Did you end up taking the standard leave?" I asked. "I had to take unpaid leave beyond what the firm approved," Rebecca said. "My mother needed more care than the policy allowed. so I basically had to choose between family obligations and career security. I took the leave and dealt with the financial consequences. How did it affect your standing at the firm when you returned? Rebecca's expression grew more serious. That's actually why I wanted to talk to you. When I came back, I found that my client assignments had been redistributed and my role had been restructured. Nothing dramatic or obviously retaliatory, just a gradual reduction in responsibilities and opportunities. The parallel to my conversation with Peterson was unmistakable. The same careful language about client feedback and operational efficiency, the same redistribution of high-value work to other associates, the same insistence that the changes were purely business decisions. How did you handle it? I asked. I documented everything and tried to rebuild my client relationships, but the damage was already done, Rebecca said. My billing hours dropped, my performance reviews became more critical, and I was passed over for promotion twice. I'm actually looking for opportunities at other firms now. The revelation that Rebecca was planning to leave Morrison and Associates after experiencing retaliation for her family leave request was both sobering and informative. It suggested that the firm's approach to these situations was systematically designed to encourage departures rather than accommodate employee needs. Rebecca, would you be willing to document your experience formally? I asked. If there's a pattern of retaliation, that could be relevant to legal action. She considered the question carefully before responding. I'd be willing to share information confidentially, but I can't afford to burn bridges before I have another position secured. The legal world is smaller than people think, and Morrison and Associates has a lot of influence with other firms. I understood her caution. Professional networks in specialized fields like consulting and law were tightly interconnected, and reputations could be damaged across multiple organizations if someone was perceived as a troublemaker or litigious employee. I appreciate you sharing this with me, I said. It helps to know that I'm not the only one who's experienced this kind of treatment. You're definitely not alone, Rebecca said, standing to leave. I suspect there are other cases if you know where to look. Janet Hoffman has been the HR director for 4 years, and the firm's demographic composition hasn't exactly improved during her tenure. After Rebecca left, I spent some time researching Morrison and Associates' employment demographics using publicly available information from professional association directories and the firm's own marketing materials. The data was striking. Over the past 4 years, the percentage of women in senior associate and partner positions had actually declined, despite increased recruitment of female candidates at the entry level. The pattern suggested that women were joining the firm but not advancing through the partnership track at the same rate as their male colleagues. Given what Rebecca had shared about the treatment of family leave requests, it seemed likely that motherhood was serving as an informal barrier to advancement, regardless of the firm's official policies about equal opportunity employment. I was deep in this research when my phone rang with a call from Jessica, my college roommate. The timing was perfect, as I needed perspective from someone who understood both corporate culture and employment law. Jess, perfect timing, I said, accepting the call. I could really use your legal brain right now. That sounds ominous, Jessica said with the directness that had always characterized our friendship. What's going on in the world of corporate consulting? I gave her a comprehensive overview of my situation, starting with the maternity leave denial and continuing through my conversation with Peterson and Rebecca's revelations about similar treatment. Jessica listened without interruption, occasionally, making notes that I could hear on her end of the line. Sarah, this sounds like a textbook case of pregnancy discrimination and retaliation, she said when I finished. The fact that they're restructuring your assignments immediately after your appeal suggests they're not even trying to hide the connection. But they're being careful about the language they use, I pointed out. Everything is framed in terms of business needs and client preferences. It would be hard to prove that my pregnancy is the real motivation. That's exactly how these cases work, Jessica said. Employers have learned to avoid explicit discrimination, but the patterns and timing tell the real story. The key is documenting everything and looking for comparisons with how male employees or non-pregnant women are treated in similar situations. She paused for a moment before continuing. Sarah, you need to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better. Based on what you've described, it sounds like the firm is trying to create conditions that will encourage you to leave voluntarily rather than fight for your rights. That's what I'm starting to suspect too, I admitted. But I don't want to give up without exploring every option. This isn't just about me. It's about whether women can actually advance at firms like this while having families. I respect that, and I'll help however I can, Jessica said. But you should also start thinking about backup plans. Document everything, save all your communications, and consider reaching out to an employment attorney who specializes in pregnancy discrimination cases. The conversation with Jessica clarified my thinking about the challenges ahead while reinforcing my determination to see the process through. The pattern Rebecca had described suggested that Morrison & Associates had perfected a system for discouraging women from pursuing family leave rights while maintaining plausible deniability about discriminatory practices. That afternoon's conference call with the Hartwell team provided additional evidence for my growing suspicions about the firm's real motivations. Mark Stevens handled the client communication competently, but lacked the deep understanding of their operational challenges that had made my contributions valuable. The client representatives were polite, but clearly confused about why I was no longer leading their engagement. After the call, I received an email from Patricia Hartwell, the company's chief operating officer, asking if she could speak with me directly about the transition. Her message was diplomatically worded, but clearly expressed concern about the change in leadership for their project. I forwarded Patricia's email to Peterson with a note explaining that the client had requested direct communication about the transition. His response came back within an hour, reiterating that all client communications should go through Mark and emphasizing that creating confusion about account management would not serve anyone's interests. The prohibition against client contact became more problematic when I received a second email from Patricia, this time sent to my personal email address. She had clearly researched my contact information independently, suggesting that her concerns about the transition were significant, enough to warrant circumventing normal firm channels. Sarah, her email read, I hope it's appropriate for me to reach out directly, but I wanted to express our team's appreciation for your work on our operational assessment. The insights you've provided have been instrumental in our strategic planning process. We're concerned about maintaining momentum on the project and would welcome any guidance you can provide about ensuring continuity during this transition. The message put me in a difficult position. Patricia was clearly seeking reassurance about the quality of service they would receive from the new team configuration, but responding to her inquiry would directly violate Peterson's instructions about client communication. At the same time, ignoring a direct request from a major client seemed professionally irresponsible. I decided to craft a diplomatic response that acknowledged her concerns while directing her to the appropriate firm channels. Patricia, thank you for your kind words about our work together. I'm confident that Mark Stevens and the Hartwell team will continue to provide the high-quality analysis and strategic support that your operational assessment requires. For any specific questions about the project timeline or deliverables, I'd recommend reaching out to Mark directly or contacting James Peterson, who oversees all client relationships in our practice area. The response satisfied my professional obligations while avoiding direct violation of Peterson's communication restrictions. However, it also highlighted the awkward position that Morrison & Associates' handling of my transition was creating with valuable clients. Later that evening, David and I met for dinner at a quiet restaurant near our apartment, where I could update him on the day's developments without being overheard by colleagues or clients. The accumulating evidence of systematic discrimination was both validating and overwhelming, confirming my suspicions while raising questions about how to respond effectively. It sounds like they've done this before, David observed after I had summarized the conversations with Peterson and Rebecca. They have a playbook for handling women who request family leave, and they're executing it step by step. That's what makes it so insidious, I said. Every individual action seems reasonable on its surface. Restructuring client assignments for operational efficiency, implementing new performance metrics, responding to client feedback. It's only when you look at the pattern that the discrimination becomes obvious. But patterns can be evidence too, David pointed out. If you can show that this treatment is consistently applied to women who request family leave, that's a strong foundation for legal action. We spent the evening discussing strategy and timelines, trying to balance my desire to fight for principle with practical considerations about career damage and financial security. The challenge was that pursuing legal action would likely end my career at Morrison & Associates regardless of the outcome, while accepting the discrimination would send a message that such treatment was acceptable. "Sarah," David said as we walked home through the December evening, "whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'm proud of how you're handling this. A lot of people would just accept the unfair treatment and try to make the best of it." "I can't do that," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "Not just because of our situation, but because of all the women who will face this same choice in the future. If nobody challenges the system, it never changes." That night, I lay in bed thinking about the broader implications of my situation. Morrison & Associates presented itself as a progressive, merit-based organization that valued diversity and employee development. The reality I was discovering suggested something far different. A firm that had learned to maintain traditional hierarchies while using sophisticated language to disguise discriminatory practices. The pregnancy that should have been a source of excitement and anticipation had become a lens through which I could see the true nature of an organization I had believed in and worked hard to advance within. The revelation was painful, but also clarifying, providing insight into systemic problems that extended far beyond my individual circumstances. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself thinking about the women who would face similar choices in the future. The appeals process I was pursuing might not change my own situation, but it could create a record that would be valuable for others who encountered the same discriminatory treatment. The documentation I was gathering might serve as evidence for legal action that could ultimately force Morrison & Associates to change its practices. The battle ahead would be difficult and uncertain, but it was also necessary. The system that had failed me was failing other women as well, and challenging it was both a personal imperative and a professional responsibility. Tomorrow would bring new developments and new challenges, but tonight I felt clear about my path forward, regardless of the personal cost. The third week of January brought an unusual warmth to Chicago, as if the city were holding its breath before the inevitable return of winter's harsh grip. I stood in the lobby of Morrison & Associates at 7:30 in the morning, watching the familiar parade of ambitious professionals hurrying toward the elevator banks, and realized that I no longer felt like I belonged among them. The appeals committee had scheduled my hearing for today, and everything I had worked toward for the past 3 years would be decided in the next few hours. Sleep had eluded me for most of the night, not because of anxiety about the outcome, but because of a growing certainty that regardless of what the committee decided, my time at Morrison & Associates was drawing to a close. The systematic marginalization I had experienced over the past month had made it clear that winning the appeal might be a Pyrrhic victory, granting me the right to extended leave while ensuring that I returned to a firm that viewed me as a liability rather than an asset. Michelle greeted me with unusual solemnity when I reached my office, her normally cheerful demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like grief. She had been watching the gradual dismantling of my client portfolio with increasing distress, understanding better than most people how much my professional identity was tied to the meaningful work I had been systematically stripped of. "The committee meeting is scheduled for 10 o'clock in the main conference room," she said, handing me a stack of documents that had arrived overnight. Mr. Morrison's assistant confirmed that all 5 committee members will be attending, plus Janet Hoffman and someone from the legal department. The composition of the meeting felt more like a tribunal than an appeals hearing, with enough decision-makers present to suggest that my case had attracted attention from the highest levels of firm management. Robert Morrison's personal involvement was particularly significant, since the founding partner rarely participated in routine personnel matters. I spent the morning hours reviewing my documentation one final time, organizing exhibits and preparing responses to the questions I anticipated from the committee. The 15-page appeal I had submitted 3 weeks earlier laid out a comprehensive case for policy interpretation, performance-based exceptions, and discriminatory treatment. But I knew that legal arguments would only carry weight if the committee was genuinely committed to fair evaluation. At 9:45, I gathered my materials and walked toward the main conference room, passing colleagues who offered encouraging smiles while carefully avoiding any substantive conversation about my situation. The firm's culture of discretion around personnel matters meant that most employees understood something significant was happening without knowing the specific details. The conference room occupied a prime corner of the 34th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of downtown Chicago and Lake Michigan beyond. The space was designed to impress clients and intimidate employees, with a massive mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that conveyed both luxury and authority. 5 men in expensive suits were already seated around the table when I entered, their ages ranging from early 40s to mid-60s, representing different practice areas and seniority levels within the firm. Robert Morrison occupied the head of the table, his silver hair and commanding presence making it clear who held ultimate authority in the room. Janet Hoffman sat along one wall with a woman I didn't recognize, presumably the legal representative Michelle had mentioned. "Sarah, please take a seat," Morrison said, gesturing toward the chair directly across from him. His tone was neutral, but not unfriendly, suggesting that he intended to conduct the hearing with appropriate formality rather than predetermined hostility. I had met Morrison only briefly during my 3 years at the firm, but his reputation as a brilliant strategist and demanding leader was well established throughout the organization. At 72, he remained actively involved in major client relationships and strategic decisions, though he had gradually delegated day-to-day management responsibilities to younger partners. "Thank you for taking the time to review my appeal," I said, settling into the designated chair and placing my documentation folder on the table. "I appreciate the opportunity to present additional context about my situation." "We've all reviewed your written submission," Morrison replied, "and we have some questions about both the factual claims and the legal interpretations you've presented." Janet will begin by summarizing the HR department's position, then we'll hear your response. Janet opened a leather portfolio and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. Her presentation was methodical and professional, outlining the firm's leave policies, my tenure and position, and the basis for denying my request for extended maternity leave. She emphasized the importance of consistent policy application and the potential legal risks of making exceptions based on individual circumstances. The employee handbook clearly establishes tenure requirements for extended family leave, she concluded. Ms. Walker has been with the firm for 3 years, which places her below the 5-year threshold for enhanced benefits. Granting her request would create precedent that could expose the firm to claims of arbitrary policy enforcement. The presentation was exactly what I had expected, focusing on policy compliance while avoiding any discussion of my performance record or the firm's stated commitment to supporting employee development. Janet's reference to legal risks was particularly ironic, given the potential liability created by discriminatory treatment of pregnant employees. Morrison turned to me with an expression that seemed genuinely interested in hearing my response. "Sarah, you've had an opportunity to hear HR's position. What would you like the committee to consider as we evaluate your appeal?" I had rehearsed this moment countless times over the past 3 weeks, but sitting in the imposing conference room with 5 senior partners evaluating my every word felt different than any preparation could have anticipated. The stakes were clear. This was my only opportunity to present a comprehensive case for why my situation warranted exceptional treatment. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," I began, opening my documentation folder. "I'd like the committee to consider 3 key points that I believe demonstrate why my request should be approved despite the standard tenure requirements." I proceeded to outline my performance record, highlighting specific achievements that had generated substantial revenue for the firm and created lasting client relationships. The Hartwell engagement alone had resulted in over $3 million in billings, with client satisfaction scores that ranked in the top 5% of all firm engagements. Beyond individual performance metrics, I continued, I'd like to address the broader question of how the firm's leave policies align with its stated commitment to retaining top talent and supporting professional development. The current system creates a disincentive for high-performing employees to start families during their most productive career years. One of the committee members, Thomas Bradley from the corporate finance practice, leaned forward with apparent interest. "Sarah, are you suggesting that our leave policies are discriminatory in their application?" The question was direct and potentially dangerous, since allegations of discrimination could shift the discussion from policy interpretation to legal liability. However, it also provided an opportunity to present the evidence I had gathered about patterns of treatment for women requesting family leave. "I'm suggesting that the policies may have discriminatory effects, even if that wasn't the intended purpose," I replied carefully. When I researched the firm's demographic composition over the past 5 years, I found that women represent 42% of incoming associate classes, but only 18% of senior associates and partners. The correlation with family formation years suggests that our leave policies may be contributing to talent retention challenges. The statistic landed with visible impact around the table. Several committee members exchanged glances, and Morrison's expression shifted to something that looked like genuine concern. Janet Hoffman, meanwhile, appeared uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Those numbers reflect normal attrition patterns in professional services," Janet interjected. "Many factors contribute to career progression decisions, and it would be inappropriate to assume that leave policies are the primary driver of demographic changes." "That's true," I acknowledged. But when I spoke with other women who have requested family leave, I discovered a consistent pattern of career consequences that seemed designed to encourage departures rather than accommodate employee needs. I proceeded to describe Rebecca Martinez's experience without naming her specifically, focusing on the parallel treatment we had both received following our leave requests. The immediate reassignment of major clients, the restructuring of responsibilities, and the careful language used to frame these changes as business decisions rather than retaliation. The committee listened with increasing attention as I outlined the systematic nature of the treatment, connecting individual incidents into a broader pattern that suggested intentional discrimination rather than coincidental business decisions. By the time I finished presenting the evidence, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from routine policy review to serious investigation of institutional practices. Morrison was the first to break the silence that followed my presentation. "Sarah, these are serious allegations that go well beyond the scope of your individual leave request. Are you prepared to provide specific documentation to support these claims?" "I am," I said, removing a separate folder from my materials. "I've documented my own experiences in detail, including dates, witnesses, and written communications. I also have information about similar treatment of other employees, though I understand their concerns about confidentiality." The legal representative who had been silent throughout the hearing suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Morrison, I'd recommend that we pause this discussion to allow for a more thorough review of the allegations being presented. These matters may require investigation by outside counsel rather than resolution through the internal appeals process." Her intervention confirmed what I had suspected. My appeal had evolved beyond a simple policy dispute into a potential legal liability for the firm. The committee members seemed to recognize this shift, with several looking uncomfortable about continuing the discussion without additional legal guidance. Morrison considered the legal representative's suggestion for a moment before responding. "I think that's prudent advice. Sarah, we're going to suspend this hearing to allow for a comprehensive review of the issues you've raised. In the meantime, I want to ensure that there's no retaliation related to your participation in this process." The promise of protection against retaliation was reassuring in theory, but I had already experienced enough subtle consequences to know that corporate policies were often more effective on paper than in practice. Still, Morrison's direct involvement suggested that my situation had reached a level of visibility that might provide some actual protection. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate the committee's willingness to consider the broader implications of these policies. My goal isn't to create problems for the firm, but to ensure that talented employees aren't forced to choose between career advancement and family obligations." As the meeting concluded, I gathered my materials with a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The hearing had gone better than I had dared to hope, with the committee showing genuine interest in the systemic issues I had raised. However, I also understood that exposing discriminatory practices within a prestigious law firm was likely to have consequences that extended far beyond my individual situation. Janet Hoffman approached me as I prepared to leave the conference room, her expression unreadable but her posture suggesting someone preparing for an unpleasant conversation. "Sarah, I hope you understand the seriousness of the allegations you've made today," she said, keeping her voice low enough that the departing committee members couldn't overhear. "False accusations of discrimination can have severe consequences for both individuals and organizations." The thinly veiled threat was delivered with the same professional tone she had used throughout our previous interactions, but the message was unmistakable. Janet was warning me that pursuing discrimination claims could result in retaliation more severe than anything I had experienced so far. "I understand the seriousness," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "That's why I've been careful to document everything and focus on verifiable facts rather than speculation or personal grievances." She nodded curtly and walked away without further comment, leaving me alone in the conference room with its commanding views of the city below. Looking out at the sprawling urban landscape, I reflected on how my perspective on corporate success had changed over the past month. The gleaming towers and bustling activity that had once represented opportunity and achievement now seemed more ambiguous, hiding systems of power and exclusion that were invisible from the outside. The elevator ride back to my office gave me time to process what had just occurred and consider my next steps. The appeals hearing had exceeded my expectations in terms of receptiveness to my arguments, but it had also escalated the situation beyond anything I had initially anticipated. What had started as a request for extended maternity leave had evolved into a comprehensive challenge to the firm's employment practices. Michelle was waiting anxiously when I reached my desk, clearly eager for information about how the hearing had progressed. Her loyalty and discretion throughout the ordeal had been invaluable, providing both practical support and emotional encouragement during the most difficult moments. "How did it go?" she asked, glancing around to ensure we wouldn't be overheard. "Better than expected in some ways," I said, settling into my chair with relief at being back in familiar surroundings. The committee seemed genuinely interested in the issues I raised, but it's also clear that this has become much bigger than my individual situation. "What happens next?" "They're suspending the appeals process to allow for a more comprehensive review," I explained. Morrison mentioned the possibility of outside counsel, which suggests they're taking the discrimination allegations seriously. Michelle nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds positive, but it also sounds like it could take a long time to resolve." She was right, and the extended timeline created its own challenges. My pregnancy was progressing normally, but I would need to make decisions about my leave regardless of how the appeals process ultimately concluded. The firm couldn't indefinitely postpone addressing my immediate needs while investigating broader policy issues. Over the next several days, I noticed subtle changes in how colleagues interacted with me. People who had previously stopped by my office for casual conversation seemed to be avoiding unnecessary contact, while others made a point of expressing support in ways that felt slightly forced. The firm's informal communication network had clearly spread word about my appeals hearing, though the specific details remained confidential. Peterson's behavior was particularly telling. He had always been direct and professional in our interactions, but now he seemed cautious and formal, as if every conversation carried potential legal implications. When I submitted my weekly project reports, he responded with brief acknowledgments, rather than the substantive feedback he had typically provided. The most significant development came on Thursday afternoon, when I received an unexpected call from Morrison's assistant requesting a meeting for the following morning. The timing was unusual, since senior partners typically scheduled meetings well in advance rather than requesting next-day availability. "Mr. Morrison would like to speak with you privately about your situation," his assistant explained. "He asked me to block off an hour starting at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." The prospect of a private meeting with the founding partner was both encouraging and intimidating. Morrison's personal involvement suggested that my case had attracted serious attention from firm leadership, but it also meant that the stakes had increased dramatically. Whatever he wanted to discuss would likely determine the trajectory of both my career and my legal options. That evening, David and I spent hours discussing strategy and possible outcomes for the meeting with Morrison. The extended appeals process had created uncertainty that was affecting every aspect of our planning, from finances to childcare arrangements to long-term career goals. "What do you think he wants?" David asked as we prepared dinner in our small kitchen, the domestic routine providing a comforting contrast to the corporate drama consuming most of my mental energy. "It could be anything," I admitted. "Maybe an offer to settle the leave request quietly, maybe a warning about the consequences of pursuing discrimination claims, or maybe genuine interest in addressing the systemic issues I raised. Which outcome would you prefer?" The question forced me to consider what I really wanted from this entire process. The original goal of extended maternity leave seemed almost secondary now to the broader questions about equality and fairness that had emerged from my research into the firm's practices. "I want them to acknowledge that their current system is discriminatory and commit to meaningful changes," I said, surprising myself with the clarity of my response. "The leave issue is important for our family, but the bigger problem affects every woman who works there." David nodded approvingly. "That's what I hoped you'd say. You've uncovered something significant, and walking away quietly wouldn't serve anyone's interests except Morrison and Associates." Friday morning arrived with the kind of gray January weather that made Chicago feel particularly grim, as if the city were reflecting the mood of its inhabitants rather than simply experiencing seasonal weather patterns. I dressed more carefully than usual for my meeting with Morrison, choosing a conservative suit that conveyed professionalism while remaining comfortable for my expanding pregnancy. Morrison's office occupied the entire northeast corner of the 35th floor, with windows facing both the lake and the downtown core. The space was designed to impress, with expensive artwork, custom furniture, and enough square footage to accommodate multiple seating areas for different types of meetings. He was standing by the windows when his assistant showed me in, gazing out at the lake with the contemplative expression of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions with significant consequences. At 72, Morrison remained an imposing figure, tall and lean with silver hair and intelligent eyes that missed very little. "Sarah, thank you for making time on short notice," he said, turning from the windows to gesture toward a comfortable seating area away from his imposing desk. "I thought it would be useful for us to have a private conversation about your situation." I took the offered seat, noting that he had chosen the informal setting rather than the more intimidating arrangement across his desk. The choice suggested that he intended this to be a genuine discussion rather than a formal confrontation. "I appreciate the opportunity," I said. "I know you must have many demands on your time." Morrison settled into the chair across from me, his expression serious, but not hostile. "Sarah, I've been thinking a great deal about what you presented to the appeals committee. Your performance record speaks for itself, and the patterns you identified in our employment practices are deeply concerning." The acknowledgement was more direct than I had expected, suggesting that he had conducted his own investigation into the allegations I had raised. If Morrison was prepared to acknowledge discriminatory patterns, it might indicate genuine interest in addressing the problems rather than simply managing the legal liability. "I'm glad the committee found the information useful," I said carefully. My goal was to provide context that might help the firm understand why policy flexibility could serve everyone's interests. "That's exactly what concerns me," Morrison replied. "You shouldn't have needed to conduct your own research into employment discrimination to get a fair hearing for a reasonable leave request. The fact that you did suggests we have fundamental problems with how we treat our employees." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully before continuing. "Sarah, I founded this firm 32 years ago with the belief that excellence should be rewarded regardless of personal circumstances. If we've created a culture that penalizes talented people for starting families, then we've failed to live up to our own values." The admission was remarkable in its directness and apparent sincerity. Morrison was acknowledging not just policy, problems, but cultural failures that went to the heart of the firm's identity and reputation. Such acknowledgments from senior leadership were rare in corporate environments, where liability concerns typically prevented candid discussions of institutional shortcomings. "What I'd like to propose," Morrison continued, "is a comprehensive review of our employment practices with a focus on identifying and eliminating discriminatory effects. I want you to lead that review, working with outside consultants and legal experts to ensure objectivity and thoroughness." The proposal was unexpected and significant, offering not just resolution of my individual situation, but the opportunity to drive systemic change within the organization. However, it also raised questions about timing, compensation, and the potential impact on my career trajectory. "That's an intriguing proposal," I said. "What would that role look like in practical terms, particularly given my upcoming family leave?" "We would structure it as a special project assignment that could accommodate your schedule and family obligations," Morrison explained. "The timeline would be flexible, the compensation would reflect the senior-level nature of the work, and you would have direct access to firm leadership to ensure your recommendations receive serious consideration." The offer was appealing in many ways, providing both professional opportunity and the chance to address the discrimination I had experienced. However, it also represented a significant departure from my original career path and raised questions about whether Morrison and Associates could genuinely change its culture or whether this was an elaborate attempt to co-opt my criticism. "I'd need to understand more about the scope and structure of such a role," I said, "and I'd want assurance that the review would have real authority to implement changes rather than simply documenting problems." Morrison nodded, seemingly prepared for such concerns. "Of course, I'm not asking for an immediate answer, just consideration of whether this might be a mutually beneficial way forward. Take whatever time you need to evaluate the proposal." As our meeting concluded, I felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of achieving meaningful change while maintaining my career at Morrison & Associates. Morrison's apparent commitment to addressing discriminatory practices seemed genuine, and the proposed role would allow me to use my skills in service of broader social justice goals. However, I also understood that institutional change was difficult and often incomplete, particularly when it challenged established power structures and financial interests. The true test of Morrison's commitment would come when recommendations conflicted with traditional practices or threatened to reduce profitability. Walking back to my office, I reflected on how dramatically my situation had evolved since that first meeting with Janet Hoffman 6 weeks earlier. What had begun as a straightforward policy dispute had become a comprehensive examination of workplace discrimination and an opportunity to drive systemic change. The transformation was both empowering and daunting, representing possibilities I had never imagined when I first decided to challenge the firm's leave policies. The rest of Friday was consumed by routine client work and project management, providing a welcome respite from the intensity of discrimination investigations and appeals processes. However, the normal rhythm of consulting work felt different, now informed by a deeper understanding of the institutional context in which it occurred. That evening, David and I celebrated the potential breakthrough with dinner at our favorite neighborhood restaurant, a cozy Italian place that had become our go-to spot for marking significant occasions. The mood was cautiously optimistic, recognizing that Morrison's proposal represented progress while remaining realistic about the challenges ahead. "So you could potentially turn this entire experience into a promotion?" David asked, twirling pasta around his fork with the concentrated attention of someone processing complex information. "It's more complicated than that," I said. "The role Morrison described would be influential and well compensated, but it would also be temporary and focused on a very specific set of issues. I'm not sure how it would position me for traditional partnership track advancement." "Maybe traditional advancement isn't the goal anymore," David suggested. "Maybe this is an opportunity to define success on your own terms rather than accepting someone else's definition." His observation resonated with thoughts I had been having about my long-term career goals. The past month had forced me to question assumptions about success and achievement that had guided my professional decisions for years. Perhaps there were ways to build a meaningful career that didn't require accepting discriminatory systems or compromising fundamental values about equality and fairness. As we walked home through the quiet Lincoln Park neighborhood, I felt a sense of possibility that had been absent during the most difficult weeks of my ordeal. The path forward remained uncertain, but for the first time since filing my maternity leave request, I felt like I had some control over my destiny rather than simply reacting to institutional pressures. The weekend provided time for reflection and strategic planning, allowing me to consider Morrison's proposal from multiple angles while researching similar roles at other organizations. The more I learned about employment discrimination consulting, the more intrigued I became by the possibility of specializing in work that combined my analytical skills with meaningful social impact. By Sunday evening, I had reached a preliminary decision about how to respond to Morrison's offer, though I wanted to consult with Jessica and other advisors before making any final commitments. The proposal represented both opportunity and risk, requiring careful evaluation of how it might affect my long-term career prospects and personal goals. Monday morning brought news that would complicate my decision-making process significantly. Michelle informed me that Janet Hoffman had requested a meeting for later that morning, supposedly to discuss administrative details related to my pending leave request. The timing seemed suspicious, coming just 3 days after my meeting with Morrison and potentially representing an attempt to influence my response to his proposal. The meeting with Janet proved to be every bit as problematic as I had anticipated. She began by expressing concern about the impact my appeals process was having on firm morale and suggested that continuing to pursue discrimination allegations could create a hostile work environment for other employees. "Sarah, I understand that you feel your treatment has been unfair," she said, her tone suggesting patience with an unreasonable employee. "But at some point, we need to consider the broader implications of these allegations for the firm's reputation and employee relations." The suggestion that I was responsible for creating problems rather than exposing them was both predictable and infuriating. Janet's attempt to reframe my discrimination claims as disruptive behavior demonstrated exactly the kind of institutional resistance that made systemic change so difficult. "Janet, I'm not sure I understand your concern," I replied. Are you suggesting that documenting discriminatory practices is somehow harmful to employee relations? I'm suggesting that false allegations of discrimination can damage innocent people's reputations and create unnecessary conflict within the organization, she said, her voice taking on an edge that suggested growing frustration with my refusal to be intimidated. The conversation continued in this vein for another 20 minutes, with Janet alternating between veiled threats and expressions of concern for my well-being. Her message was clear: drop the discrimination allegations and accept a standard maternity leave arrangement, or face consequences that could extend well beyond my employment at Morrison & Associates. By the time I left Janet's office, I was more convinced than ever that accepting Morrison's proposal was the right path forward. The continuing resistance from HR demonstrated that meaningful change would require sustained effort and high-level support, both of which the special project role would provide. That afternoon, I called Morrison's assistant to schedule another meeting, ready to discuss the terms and structure of the proposed employment discrimination review. The decision felt like a leap of faith, but also like the most authentic choice I could make given everything I had learned about myself and my values over the past 2 months. The battle that had begun with a simple maternity leave request was entering a new phase, one that held the promise of genuine systemic change alongside the continued risk of professional retaliation. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I was choosing my own path, rather than simply responding to forces beyond my control. The conference room on the 36th floor had been transformed into what could only be described as a war room. Charts, graphs, and organizational diagrams covered every available wall surface, creating a visual representation of 3 decades of employment data at Morrison & Associates. It had been 6 weeks since I accepted Robert Morrison's offer to lead the comprehensive employment practices review, and what we had discovered was far more extensive and systematic than even I had anticipated. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the employment law specialist we had retained from Northwestern University, stood before a particularly damning chart showing promotion rates by gender over the past decade. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses missed nothing as she analyzed the data we had painstakingly assembled. "Sarah, these numbers don't just suggest discrimination," she said, tapping the chart with her laser pointer. "They document a pattern so consistent that it would be virtually impossible to explain through random variation or individual choice factors." The statistics were indeed striking. Over the past 10 years, men at Morrison & Associates had been promoted to senior associate positions at a rate of 68%, while women achieved promotion at only 31%. The disparity became even more pronounced at the partnership level, where men were elevated at nearly 3 times the rate of their female colleagues. "What makes this particularly compelling as evidence," Dr. Vasquez continued, "is that the disparities can't be explained by performance differentials. In fact, the data shows that women consistently receive higher performance ratings in their first 3 years, yet somehow fail to advance at proportionate rates." I had spent countless hours over the past month and a half reviewing personnel, files, performance evaluations, and promotion decisions with Dr. Vasquez and her research team. What had emerged was a picture of an organization that systematically undervalued women's contributions while maintaining the appearance of merit-based decision-making. The methodology we had employed was rigorous and comprehensive. Working with Morrison's full authorization, we had gained access to confidential personnel records dating back to 2010, allowing us to track career trajectories for every employee who had joined the firm during that period. We had also conducted anonymous surveys with current and former employees, gathered salary data, and analyzed assignment patterns for major client engagements. My role in the investigation had evolved beyond what either Morrison or I had initially envisioned. Rather than simply documenting problems, I had become the primary architect of a comprehensive reform proposal that would fundamentally alter how Morrison & Associates approached hiring, promotion, and employee development. The work was intellectually stimulating in ways that reminded me why I had been drawn to consulting in the first place. Every day brought new analytical challenges as we sought to understand not just what was happening, but why discriminatory patterns had become so deeply embedded in the firm's culture and practices. Dr. Vasquez moved to another chart showing the relationship between family status and career advancement. This data is particularly revealing because it shows that the gender disparities become most pronounced after employees reach their late 20s and early 30s, exactly when most people are making decisions about starting families. The correlation was unmistakable. Women who remained childless or delayed childbearing until their late 30s advanced at rates much closer to their male colleagues, while those who had children during their prime career development years saw their advancement slow dramatically. We've also identified what appears to be a systematic bias in client assignment patterns, I added, pulling up a presentation I had prepared on this specific issue. Women are consistently assigned to smaller, less prestigious clients during their childbearing years, ostensibly to reduce travel requirements and workload pressure. However, these assignments inevitably result in lower billing hours and reduced visibility with senior partners. The client assignment analysis had been one of my most significant contributions to the investigation. By tracking assignment patterns over multiple years, we had been able to demonstrate that supposedly supportive policies actually functioned as career limitations that prevented women from building the kind of client relationships essential for partnership consideration. The irony, Dr. Vasquez observed, is that these policies were likely implemented with good intentions. The firm believed it was being family-friendly by reducing travel and pressure for women with children. Instead, it created a separate and unequal track that virtually guaranteed slower career progression. Our research had revealed similar patterns across multiple firm policies and practices. Flexible work arrangements that were ostensibly gender-neutral were disproportionately used by women and subsequently viewed as indicators of reduced commitment. Parental leave policies that provided identical benefits to men and women in theory were applied differently in practice, with women facing greater scrutiny and career consequences upon their return. The investigation had also uncovered more disturbing evidence of deliberate discrimination. We had found email exchanges between partners discussing concerns about investment risk when considering women for promotion, with explicit references to the likelihood that female partners would reduce their commitment after having children. Dr. Vasquez, what's your assessment of the legal exposure the firm faces based on this evidence? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. She removed her glasses and cleaned them carefully before responding, a gesture I had learned indicated she was preparing to deliver particularly serious information. Substantial, she said finally. The patterns we've documented would almost certainly support class action litigation under Title VII. More importantly for the firm's immediate concerns, the evidence suggests that individual cases like yours represent systematic discrimination rather than isolated incidents. The legal implications had become increasingly clear as our investigation progressed. What Morrison had initially viewed as a policy interpretation dispute had evolved into documentation of enterprise-wide discrimination that could result in massive financial liability and reputational damage. My own case, which had seemed like an outlier when I first encountered resistance to my maternity leave request, now appeared typical of how the firm handled women who asserted their rights or challenged established practices. We had identified at least 12 other women over the past 5 years who had experienced similar retaliation after requesting family leave or flexible work arrangements. The discovery process had been emotionally challenging as well as intellectually demanding. Reading through personnel files and survey responses had exposed the human cost of the discrimination we were documenting. Talented women had left promising careers, accepted diminished roles, or abandoned their professional ambitions entirely because of systemic barriers they were powerless to overcome individually. Rebecca Martinez had agreed to participate in our investigation after learning about its comprehensive scope and Morrison's personal involvement. Her testimony about the gradual marginalization she had experienced after requesting family leave provided crucial corroboration for the patterns we were identifying in the quantitative data. The most insidious aspect, Rebecca had told us during her interview, was how reasonable each individual decision seemed. No one ever said I was being punished for taking leave. It was always presented as temporary adjustments or strategic reconfigurations that just happened to coincide with my reduced availability. Her experience highlighted the sophisticated nature of the discrimination we were uncovering. Rather than obvious violations like explicit statements or formal policies, the firm had developed subtle practices that achieved discriminatory outcomes while maintaining plausible deniability. This sophistication had made our investigation more complex, but also more compelling. The evidence we were assembling showed not accidental bias, but systematic practices designed to discourage women from advancing while avoiding legal liability. Dr. Vasquez had brought in additional researchers from Northwestern's business school to help analyze the economic impact of the discriminatory practices. Their preliminary findings suggested that the firm was actually harming its own financial performance by failing to retain and promote talented women. The retention analysis is particularly striking, explained Dr. James Chen, the business school researcher leading the economic impact study. When we compare the performance records of women who left the firm versus those who stayed but were passed over for promotion, we see consistently high achievement levels. The firm is essentially losing its best female talent. The economic argument for reform was becoming as compelling as the legal and ethical arguments. Morrison & Associates was sacrificing competitive advantage by maintaining practices that drove away high-performing employees based on gender rather than merit. We had also begun developing specific recommendations for addressing the problems we had identified. The reform proposal I was crafting went beyond simple policy changes to address the cultural and structural factors that perpetuated discrimination. The challenge, I explained to Dr. Vasquez as we reviewed my preliminary recommendations, is creating accountability mechanisms that actually change behavior rather than just documenting compliance. We were proposing a comprehensive restructuring of the firm's promotion process, with specific metrics for gender equity, blind review procedures for client assignments, and regular auditing of advancement patterns. The recommendations also included substantial changes to leadership development programs, mentoring structures, and performance evaluation criteria. The scope of the proposed changes was ambitious enough to encounter significant resistance from partners who benefited from existing arrangements. However, Morrison's continued support and the mounting evidence of legal liability were creating pressure for meaningful reform rather than cosmetic adjustments. My pregnancy had progressed to the point where my condition was obvious to everyone in the firm, adding an interesting dynamic to my role as lead investigator. Some partners seemed uncomfortable discussing employment discrimination with a visibly pregnant woman, while others appeared to view my situation as validation of the problems we were documenting. The physical demands of the investigation were manageable thanks to the flexible arrangements Morrison had authorized. I could work from home when needed, schedule meetings around medical appointments, and adjust my hours to accommodate fatigue and other pregnancy-related challenges. The contrast with my earlier experience requesting basic accommodations was not lost on me. Dr. Vasquez had been particularly valuable in helping me navigate the political complexities of conducting an investigation within an organization where I remained an employee. Her external perspective and academic credentials provided objectivity that enhanced the credibility of our findings while protecting me from accusations of bias or personal grievance. Sarah, you've developed remarkable expertise in employment discrimination analysis over these past 2 months, she observed during one of our weekly strategy sessions. Have you considered whether this might represent a new career direction rather than a temporary assignment? The question had been occupying more of my thoughts as the investigation progressed. The work was intellectually stimulating and socially meaningful in ways that traditional consulting had never been. Moreover, the skills I was developing in discrimination analysis, organizational change management, and legal compliance were increasingly valuable in a business environment where diversity and inclusion had become strategic imperatives. "I've been thinking about that," I admitted. "The question is whether there's a sustainable career path in this type of work, and whether Morrison & Associates would be interested in developing an ongoing practice area around employment equity." We had discussed the possibility of establishing a dedicated division within the firm focused on helping client organizations address discrimination and develop more inclusive practices. The market demand for such services was clearly growing, driven by both legal requirements and competitive pressure to attract and retain diverse talent. Morrison had been remarkably engaged throughout the investigation, participating in weekly briefings and providing access to any information or resources we requested. His commitment to the process had surprised many within the firm, particularly senior partners who were accustomed to his focus on financial performance and client relationships. "I've been in this business for over 30 years, he had told me during one of our meetings, "and I'm finally understanding how much talent we've wasted by maintaining systems that worked for my generation but make no sense in today's environment." His willingness to acknowledge past mistakes and support comprehensive reform had been crucial to the investigation's success. Without his authority and endorsement, we would never have gained access to the sensitive information necessary to document the extent of discriminatory practices. The investigation had also revealed the role that client expectations and industry culture played in perpetuating discrimination within the firm. Many of Morrison & Associates' corporate clients had their own diversity challenges and seemed to prefer working with male consultants, particularly for senior-level engagements. We found evidence that partners were making assignment decisions based on assumptions about client preferences, Dr. Vasquez noted, often without actually consulting the clients about their needs or preferences. This discovery had led us to survey major clients about their actual preferences regarding consultant demographics and expertise. The results were surprising. Most clients cared primarily about competence and experience, with many expressing positive interest in working with diverse consulting teams. The client survey data had provided additional support for our reform recommendations by demonstrating that gender equity initiatives were likely to enhance, rather than harm, client relationships. Progressive corporate clients were increasingly evaluating their service providers based on diversity and inclusion metrics, creating competitive advantages for firms that could demonstrate strong gender equity performance. As we entered the final phase of our investigation, the scope of change required was becoming clear. The problems we had identified were too systematic and extensive to be addressed through incremental adjustments. Meaningful reform would require fundamental restructuring of how the firm approached talent management, client relationships, and partnership decisions. The recommendations document I was preparing would run to over 200 pages, with detailed implementation timelines, accountability measures, and cost-benefit analyses. The proposal represented not just a response to my individual discrimination case, but a comprehensive blueprint for transforming Morrison & Associates into a genuinely inclusive organization. The personal impact of leading this investigation had been profound. The work had forced me to develop new skills, question assumptions about corporate culture, and consider career possibilities I had never previously imagined. More importantly, it had provided a sense of purpose and agency that had been missing from my traditional consulting work. David had been incredibly supportive throughout the process, recognizing that my involvement in the investigation represented both professional opportunity and personal healing after the discriminatory treatment I had experienced. His encouragement had been crucial during moments when the scope of the problems we were uncovering felt overwhelming. "You've found your calling," he told me one evening as I worked on the final sections of the recommendations report. "This isn't just about fixing problems at Morrison & Associates. You're developing expertise that could help organizations everywhere become more equitable and inclusive. The broader implications of our work were indeed significant. The methodology we had developed for analyzing employment discrimination could be applied at other organizations, and the reform strategies we were proposing could serve as models for industry-wide change. Dr. Vasquez had suggested that we collaborate on publishing our findings in academic journals, both to contribute to scholarly understanding of workplace discrimination and to establish my credentials as an expert in employment equity analysis. The prospect of contributing to academic literature while implementing practical reforms was appealing on multiple levels. As the investigation neared completion, I found myself facing a decision about my future with Morrison & Associates. Morrison had indicated his interest in making my role permanent, possibly as the head of a new diversity and inclusion practice area. The opportunity was attractive, but also represented a significant departure from my original career trajectory. The alternative was to use the expertise I had developed to establish an independent consulting practice focused on employment equity and organizational change management. This path would offer greater autonomy and the ability to work with multiple clients, but also carried more financial risk and uncertainty. The deadline for completing our investigation was approaching rapidly. Morrison had scheduled a presentation to the full partnership for the following week, where our findings and recommendations would be formally presented. The meeting would likely determine not only the future of employment practices at Morrison & Associates, but also my own career direction. The evidence we had assembled was compelling, but I understood that implementing meaningful change would require sustained effort beyond the investigation phase. Cultural transformation was a long-term process that demanded ongoing commitment, from leadership and accountability mechanisms that could survive personnel changes and economic pressures. The final report included specific recommendations for monitoring and enforcement, with quarterly reviews of promotion patterns, annual audits of assignment practices, and regular surveys of employee experiences. We had also proposed establishing an ombudsman position to provide confidential reporting channels for employees experiencing discrimination. The financial analysis Dr. Chen had completed showed that implementing our recommendations would require significant short-term investment, but was likely to generate positive returns through improved retention, enhanced reputation, and access to diverse talent pools. The business case for reform was as strong as the legal and ethical arguments. On the Friday before the partnership presentation, I sat in the converted conference room surrounded by months of research and analysis, reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed since that first frustrating meeting with Janet Hoffman. What had begun as a personal grievance about maternity leave policies had evolved into a comprehensive examination of institutional discrimination and an opportunity to drive meaningful change. The investigation had validated my experiences while also revealing that the problems were far more extensive than I had initially realized. The systematic nature of the discrimination we had documented was both disturbing and empowering, providing clear evidence that change was both necessary and possible. Dr. Vasquez joined me for a final review of our presentation materials, bringing her characteristic precision and thoroughness to the task of ensuring that every claim was properly supported and every recommendation was clearly justified. "Sarah, you should be proud of what you've accomplished here," she said, as we organized the materials for Monday's presentation. This investigation represents some of the most comprehensive documentation of workplace discrimination I've encountered in my academic career. The validation from someone of her stature was meaningful, particularly given the personal and professional risks I had taken by challenging the firm's practices. The investigation had required me to develop new skills, confront uncomfortable truths, and maintain professional objectivity while examining my own experiences of discrimination. The presentation to the partnership would be the culmination of months of intensive work, but it would also mark the beginning of an implementation process that could take years to complete. The real test of our efforts would come in the daily decisions about hiring, promotion, and client assignment, that determined whether Morrison and Associates would actually change its culture or simply adopt new policies that failed to address underlying biases. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I felt a mixture of anticipation and determination about the challenges ahead. The evidence we had assembled was compelling, the recommendations were comprehensive, and Morrison's support provided reason for optimism about meaningful reform. However, I also understood that institutional change was difficult and often met with resistance from those who benefited from existing arrangements. The success of our efforts would depend not just on the quality of our analysis, but on the firm's willingness to prioritize equity over traditional practices and short-term convenience. The presentation on Monday would be a pivotal moment, but it would not be the end of the process. Real change would require sustained commitment, ongoing vigilance, and the courage to maintain reform efforts even when they encountered resistance or proved more difficult than anticipated. Walking home through the Chicago evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The discrimination I had experienced had been painful and frustrating, but it had also provided the motivation and insight necessary to document systemic problems and develop comprehensive solutions. The investigation had transformed my understanding of workplace discrimination from an abstract concept to a detailed analysis of how bias operated in practice. More importantly, it had provided tools and strategies for addressing discrimination that could benefit not just Morrison and Associates, but any organization committed to creating genuinely inclusive environments. The path forward remained uncertain, but for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt confident that meaningful change was possible. The evidence was clear, the recommendations were sound, and the business case for reform was compelling. What remained was the will to implement changes that would ensure that future employees would not face the systematic barriers that had nearly derailed my own career. Monday's presentation would mark the transition from investigation to implementation, from documentation to action. The real work of creating lasting change was just beginning, but the foundation we had built through months of rigorous analysis provided reason for hope that Morrison and Associates could become the inclusive organization it claimed to be. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.